the Vaudois. So this is where we begin to get this kind of transition from these heretics, and the heretics are kind of transforming into what will later be known as witches. I'm sorry, satanic witches, if you will. As I said before, they're different, and I'll explain why. This comes from a book called The Defender of Ladies, and it's translation from the French, published in 1541. So there. The next big blow to the Catholic Church was the loss of the clergy in the Black Death. In 1347, the Black Death made its way from Asia into Europe, and then, you know, up through all the various countries in Europe to England, and finally to Scotland. And, you know, at this time, of course, everybody was, you know, in the Catholic Church, and it was the clergy, the better clergy, the priests and monks, etc., who were the ones that were helping people. And those are the ones that died. And the end result was that you got kind of very second-rate clergy coming in to take their place. And their main concern was getting a sinecure and getting some money. The church also got itself not just involved in this, but also very much involved in with secular rulers in wars. The popes got involved in wars. And so people began to look, you know, with very warily at the church, and they were getting kind of disgusted with it. And so the church was losing its so-called mandate, if you will. So now we get to something called the Council of Basel that occurred in 1431. I just bring this up because it was here that a number of theologians got together and started to kind of try to figure out how come the church is under attack? What's going on? Who's doing this? Can't be our fault. And so they came up with the idea that obviously it was an international conspiracy of witches. And these witches, it was an international conspiracy started by the devil, and the witches were his servants. And these people did certain things. This fellow, I get the screen up a little higher. I don't play around with this too much. Let me just go back. Johannes Nider was a theologian at the Council of Basel, and he put together a book a few years later in which he talked about some of the characteristics of this new kind of satanic conspiracy. And these were the things that one would do. First of all, one made a pact with the devil. Secondly, had sexual relations with the devil. And third, and this is very interesting, attended a Sabbath. And if you know, I mean, it's hard to tell here with this picture, but if you look at the Sabbath here, this is something else that they said, that they took unbaptized children and murdered them, killed them, and created ointments so they could fly. It was a world turned upside down. Some of the other beliefs you can see over here, they're eating baby parts over here. They're worshiping the devil. And here you see people dancing backwards up here around this tree. And you see other people flying through the air, like here. And so these are the beliefs that people had. This was the coming belief. And why did these things happen? I mean, why do people believe this? Well, one of the things, let me just go, I'm going to go forward for a second and go back. One of the things was the invention of the printing press. These kinds of ideas were now being printed and distributed throughout Europe. Now, clearly, most people were illiterate and couldn't read, but certainly the elites and the clergy could read. And in this particular case, I'm going to go back here for a second. One of the most important books published at this time was a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, or Witch's Hammer. And why is this book important? Well, first of all, because it was printed, it was distributed. The second thing is people began to translate it into the local languages. And it's important because it discussed, first of all, it was written by a Dominican monk named Heinrich Kramer. It was distributed, it was written, and it also had a papal bull at the head of it. And the papal bull gave it the imprimatur of the papacy, and it was only supposed to be used in a particular area in Germany, but because of the papal bull, it got distributed throughout the entire, all of Europe. And as I said, it got translated. It was second to the Bible in the number of books that were distributed and sold at that time period. So that's pretty amazing. So why was it important? Well, it discussed beliefs about witches and practices, which of course other books did without too much of a problem. It detailed exactly how witches caused harm. And thirdly, and this is the most important part, it outlined the legal aspects of trying and convicting witches. It told people how to go about trying to try and convict witches. So this gave the legal authority, the legal authorities, basically, the way to figure out how they could, find out who was a witch and actually bring them to trial and convict them. And one of the wonderful things about this book is it told you that if you lied to get a confession from somebody, because the confession was the most important part, it was okay. You could do that. And plus, it laid much of the blame on women. So that's another aspect people have talked about. Something else that occurred on the continent, and I'm going to just bring this up so you'll understand something. You've heard of thousands and thousands of people that were executed as witches, probably. People think we're probably looking at about 50,000 over the time, not 200,000 or 300,000, as other people have suggested, but probably about 50,000. But this is important. One of the reasons why there were so many people that were executed on the continent, there weren't that many in England, comparatively speaking, and I'll explain why. And I bring this up because, of course, I'm going to talk about New England, which is where they got their laws from. So the whole idea, as far as the church was concerned, was, remember, it was an international conspiracy. So it was important that if you did find a witch, that you got that witch to confess, but you also got that witch to tell you who her confederates were, or his confederates. So torture, and I'm going to explain this in a second. So witchcraft on the continent was a heresy. And the Pope, back in 1252, had allowed torture for people that were heretics. So because witchcraft was a heresy, you could torture witches. And of course, when you torture people, you get more people. You're able to bring more people into conspiracy. So that was one thing that's important. Another thing that's important was because they were heretics, they were burned. And there's a passage in the Bible that talks about the fact that the person that is not, I don't think I have the quote here, wish I did. Oh, here it is. If anyone abide not in me, he shall be cast forth as a branch and shall wither, and they shall gather him up and cast him into the fire, and he burneth. And that's the quote they used, because you're obviously turning away from God, and therefore you deserve to burn. And that's what they did. They burned witches because they were heretics. The other thing that's important to know on the continent was they used Roman law, which was inquisitorial. And basically it came down to the fact that you were pretty much guilty unless they could prove you were innocent. So this is the reason why you had a lot more witch hunts, and that's why they burned witches, and there were so many of them. The other thing that's another thing that I didn't bring up too much, but of course, another factor on Europe was the Reformation, and that also caused a lot of conflict, that could lead to people being accused of being witches. So let me go to the next one, which would be Henry VIII. Why do I bring him up? Well, he's the first, as far as I'm concerned, he's the first Brexit guy. And, he did this. He pulled England out of the church and out of the Catholic orbit. But by doing so, he did something very interesting. He probably saved a lot of lives, witches' lives over the years. Under Henry VIII, his people were the first to define witchcraft as a felony, and it wasn't a heresy. It was a crime punishable by death, but it moved the crime from the church courts to regular judicial courts into the common law system. And so that was an adversarial system, and you needed to have evidence in court in order to convict somebody for being a witch. Now, it was repealed in 1547, this law, but the important thing was the crime of witchcraft remained as a felony in England. So we have in England a couple of things. First of all, witchcraft is not a felony. Witchcraft is a felony. The other thing that England has that's different is because it's a felony, torture is not permitted. So they really were not permitted to torture people to get people to confess to being witches and to bring other people into the conspiracy. The third thing, which I mentioned there, was people were tried in a court of law, which required evidence. And of course, you're considered innocent until proven guilty. I'm not going to say that the court system was fabulous, because most people probably don't know this, but you couldn't have a lawyer to defend yourself in a felony case in England until the middle of the 19th century. First third of the 19th century. So, but you had to defend yourself, but at least you had an opportunity to defend yourself. And you had common law, which was in a way was protective. So what happens now in England in 1563 is that Elizabeth, under Elizabeth, they have a new witchcraft law. The thing about this particular law was that you actually had to do something. You had to do something for the second time in order to be convicted and executed. So that was the way this law worked. But the death penalty wasn't invoked. It was only invoked where real harm had been done. For anything else, there were other things like conjuring and things like that. They didn't invoke the death penalty for that. The law was broadened under the new king, James the Sixth of Scotland, and James the First of England, when James took over the throne after Elizabeth's death. Under him in 1603, they strengthened the law, and they allowed death to anyone who invoked evil spirits or communed with evil spirits. And the death penalty could occur if you're convicted for this offense a second time also. The difference was basically they extended the law. And I'm going to tell you something that's kind of unusual about England and witches in England. England was probably one of the few places, I think in the Pyrenees, there were some areas too, that had this concept called familiars. Some of you may have heard of familiars. Usually they were some animal. I'll explain that in a little bit. But the animal was supposed to be actually an evil spirit. So this causes an issue, can cause an issue for some people. This is the book that he wrote, that James VI wrote. James I wrote, but he wrote it when he was in Scotland, and then he updated it, I guess, when he came to England. It's called The Demonology. And the thing about the demonology is that he did incorporate some of the ideas that were found on the continent into this book. But the most important thing, as far as the witch's hammer that I talked about earlier, was it was never translated into English totally. Some of the ideas found their way into England, into the England demonology writings, but the book itself was never translated into English until the 20th century. So what I want to talk about for a minute here is this book, A Guide to the Grand Juryman. And this is the last book published in England. And first of all, let me just back up just one second. So James dies in 1625, and his son Charles I comes to the throne. Charles isn't really a believer as much as his father was. And he also wants to settle things down in England. One of the problems is that the witchcraft business had kind of made people very anxious, and there were real problems. Some of you may have heard of the Lancashire witch trials and the Pendleton witches and things like that. And this had gotten people kind of, upset. And so they wanted to calm things down. It got into the literature, and you know about Shakespeare and witches and Shakespearean in Macbeth and things like that. So what they decided they were going to do was they were going to suppress all new books about witches and witchcraft in England. And so when he came to the throne, they began to do this. They forbid new books being published. At least, it didn't really get started until 1629. The ideas were percolating, but they got Bishop Laud in 1629, became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was able to stop a lot of this. But before that, in 1627, we have this book called The Guide to the Grand Juryman. And this particular writer, he was a Puritan, his name was Richard Bernard, writes a book, and his book does have a lot of material on witches. And particularly, he's very particularly interested in witches' marks, and he writes a lot about those. So this book gets published. All right, it's one of the last books on witches that's published. Now, there's a loophole. If you've previously published a book and you republish it, you put out a new edition, then you can add whatever you want to it. So this book is called The Country Justice, and it's pretty much by Michael Dalton, and it's a book for individuals who are dealing in, like sheriffs, etc., and magistrates that are dealing on legal issues, and it covers everything. And it had a little tiny section when it was first published, I think 1619, on witchcraft, on witches, how to know witches, etc. Well, after this time period, in 1631, you begin to see the section on witches gets expanded, and more material gets put into the book. And the reason they can do this is because it was previously published, and so they're just adding to it. But at the same time, there's really not too many witchcraft trials going on in England in the 1630s. And the other thing about this, is we all know, is this is when we begin to get people coming over to New England, and the Puritans begin settling in New England. So we don't have much in the way of witch hunting or witchcraft. We don't have much talk of it. There's a couple of cases in England. I mean, there's one I really go into, but there's nobody gets executed. But what happens is when the English Civil War breaks out in 1642, all the suppressed ideas about witches come back in England, and because the government breaks down, people that are familiar with the English Civil War know that it's sort of like a war between the Royalists and the Church of England versus the Puritans, and the king, is under siege by the Puritans and what sometimes called the Roundheads. So basically, what happens is you begin to get pamphlets accusing both sides, each side, of being in league with witches. And so here's an example of one from 1643. I'll give you another one. This is supposed to be somebody who's very upset, looks like a witch, because Prince Rupert's dog, who they call a familiar, is being killed in a pamphlet. This is another pamphlet. So the idea of witchcraft and witches coming back and bursting forth in all kinds of pamphlets and handbills, etc., and various writings now comes to the fore in England. And so with the breakdown in authority, we begin to get individuals who are able to go around and begin witch hunting. And the most famous one of all is Matthew Hopkins' Witchfinder. And this is his pamphlet that he put out, a book called The Discovery of Witches. And basically, he was a son of a minister who almost came to America, by the way. This is something I found out. But his father didn't go. He was invited by John Winthrop, but he decided to stay. And his son, they were in Manningtree, England, in East Anglia. He decided that he was going to find these people that they called witches. And so he, with his, John, I think it's John Stearns and a woman, midwife, the three of them began to sell their services, if you will. And he was criticized heavily for this. So he decided to write a pamphlet that would justify what he had done. And here we see Matthew Hopkins on the front cover, and there he is. There's witches, and then you can see the various familiars. And they've got names like Chamara here, and Sack and Sugar, and Peck and Grizzle, Grizzle, Greedy Gut, and Vinegar Tom, etc. Now, Hopkins pioneered a number of techniques, which today we might call them torture, but basically they weren't torture compared to the kinds of things they could do with people, like burning their feet and putting their feet into these devices that would crush them, etc. So here's what some of Hopkins' techniques were: watching a suspected witch, waiting for familiars to feed off the witch, and that, of course, as I said before, that 1604 witchcraft statute law act actually forbade feeding of any evil or wicked spirit. And how they did this is called what we call the witch's teat, which was basically would be some kind of a skin problem, probably on the like a mole or something like that on the body, and they would say that was a witch's teat, and that's where the familiar would get its sustenance from the witch. They would swim a suspected witch, which means putting the witch in water. I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. Depriving a suspected witch of sleep, inserting needles looking for what was called devil's marks, which were different from witch's teats, walking a suspected witch to exhaustion, searching for witch marks. And then the whole objective of all this was to acquire a confession. And here's an example of swimming a witch. When I say we're swimming a witch, what are we talking about this? The whole idea behind this was supposedly you would put the witch into the water. If the witch sank, it meant she was actually not a witch because the water accepted her. If the witch floated, it meant that the water did not want her. And it was tied to the idea of water being used in baptism. So that's what swimming a witch is. Searching for the witch's marks. Now, this is a famous picture. Probably you've seen it before. My understanding is they never would have searched for a witch's mark with men there. It would have been done by a women's group, from what I can tell. These new techniques, pioneered by John Hopkins, spread to Matthew Hopkins, not John Hopkins, spread to New England. And the Massachusetts court records in 1648 show that Margaret Jones' trial, there was a trial of a woman named Margaret Jones who was, she was accused and convicted of being a witch. And it was described by John Winthrop. And as a matter of fact, John Winthrop Jr., his son, was one of the jurors in the trial. This comes back later. I'll tell you about that. Now I'm going to turn to the New England settlement so we can get to some of the local issues. So in 1630, the Winthrop fleet makes its way over from England to Boston. When it gets here, they're very fortunate from the standpoint of the land that's available, because, as John Winthrop said, God hath consumed the natives with a miraculous plague, whereby the country is left void of inhabitants. And so the country was, in some respects, it was fairly empty compared to what it could have been, but it wasn't totally empty. And so the people still feared Indians. As I told you before, they felt that the Indians were the devil's servants and that they had really arrived in the devil's own territory. This is the way they felt at the time. Now, I want to bring you to the Connecticut issue, which is what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. So the first settlers, I'm talking about settlers now. Most of the settlers that came here and settled, that came on with the Winthrop fleet, came from the East Anglia area of England. The people I want to talk about came from what's called the West Country. These are the home of the settlers that settled the area around where I am right now, which is in Windsor, Connecticut. And Windsor, Connecticut is about 10 or 12 miles north of Hartford, Connecticut. So they came from these three areas, though. They didn't come from Cornwall. They came from Devon, Somerset, and Dorset. And the people, they came on a ship called the Mary and John out of Plymouth, England. There were 70 families, and some of these names I have here were really famous names, particularly Ludlow and Rossiter. We'll talk a little bit about them later. They were neighbors. They were very specifically brought together by a gentleman, I think his name was White. He was a minister. I think his name was White. I just don't have it right here. But anyway, so many of them knew each other, and they were fairly well off. They were sort of yeomen. Some of them were very wealthy. So they came here. They originally settled in Dorchester, Massachusetts, stayed there for about 5 years, and then made the trek to Connecticut. And one of the reasons why they made the trek here was because they had heard about the cattle. It was an opportunity to raise cattle, and they were actually cattle people. So they come to Windsor and they settle in Windsor. The problem is that there are a couple of other groups here. This area, there's also a group of people that have come under Lord Richard Saltonstall, and they're supposed to be building a town, if you will. They were called lords and gentlemen, but actually all they were primarily carpenters, and they were there to build the settlement. So they've got that group here. They've got a group from Plymouth, the Plymouth settlement, and they're here to do fur trading. So there's these three groups that are sort of competing in this area. Well, this fellow, Roger Ludlow, who was with the Windsor people, is fairly well known, and he actually had been, I think, a lieutenant governor in Massachusetts. But anyway, he wanted to be governor, didn't get to be governor, and decided to travel here with the rest of his group. So he gets here, and he's able to actually negotiate really good part of the best part of the town, basically. And so the people that were involved with the carpenters ended up in the northern part of Windsor, and the people from Plymouth went back to Plymouth. And the reason they went back was because of this. There was a war from 1637 to 1636 to 1637. And it's called the Pequot War. And not only was it a war against the Pequot tribe, which of course had been, they'd been troublemakers. They'd actually been enslaving other Indians. So the Pequots were, there were they had a lot of enemies. And so a lot of the other native Indian groups joined up with the white settlers, and they attacked the Pequots. They managed to wipe them out pretty much. And so what they did was they opened up southern and western Connecticut for settlement at the same time. So now, excuse me, let me get to this. Oh, I want to just back up for a quick second to tell you. So John Matthew Hopkins in England, when I was telling you about that, I forgot to tell you that he managed to go around and they must have, I'd say between 100 and 200 people were convicted of and executed for being witches in England at that time. So put the Pequot War here. So a new family had moved into Windsor. A man named John Young, some people have called him John Youngs with an S. His wife Alice and his daughter, he had a daughter Alice too. They moved around 1639/40 into Windsor. He was a carpenter. I think they likely came from London, and he knew members of this party, this party under this fellow named Niles, who were this group of people that were carpenters. I told you that were building the settlement for Rich Saltonstall. So John seems to have had a skin disease documented by John Winthrop Jr. And it's important for me. I mean, it's interesting for me because his wife likely treated him, and she may have had healing skills and used those skills to perhaps treat people and animals locally. Now, anyone in their healing skills, particularly the ministers, were concerned about that. They had the belief that maybe some of these people were actually in league with the devil. Now, in England, there were cunning people, and there were white witches and black witches, but primarily white witches. And the cunning people were accepted by many people in England. They were helpful. They did things for people. They found things. These were the kind of people that you went to. You didn't have all the different types of things like insurance and the same kind of police and investigators and things like that. These people could do that because they heard things and they knew what was going on, and they knew how to heal animals particularly. And that was very important, as well as human beings. So at the time, there were two ministers in Windsor. The reason for that is in congregational churches, there's a minister and then there's a teacher generally. So you have two ministers there. Now, Ephraim Hewitt was one of the ministers, and he came in about 1639 as well with a group of people from this. I think they were from the southern part of England also. And then their primary minister was named John Wareham. So this is an idea of what a healing woman from this time period would have looked like. So Wareham now begins to preach. We have this documentation. He begins to preach that there's the devil is amongst thee now. There's somebody is doing something in town that the ministers don't like, and they preach against this for the next year and a half. So, as I said before, you have what's called a white witch and a black witch, and the white witch is the person who could be a healer. The problem with a white witch and with healers, from as far as the Puritans were concerned, and the Puritan ministers, was that they ensnared good people, because the white witch, even though the white witch did seem to be doing good, she could only get her powers, or he could only get his powers from the devil. And so that this was worse than even the black witch. So then in the 1640s, Windsor seems to be having all kinds of problems. First of all, there's years of sickness and untimely deaths. Minister Hewitt actually dies in 1644. Windsor's attacked by Indians. The church is racked by dissension. When you see in the 1600s, particularly amongst Puritans, that there's dissension in the church, that means that the devil is involved. That's the way they thought. And there was an influenza outbreak in 1647. 25 people would eventually die that year. Now, the problem that I see in this case is that, as we'll see, the person that gets accused, first of all, let me just back up for a split second and tell you this. The reason we know about the white and the black witches is because we have a nice little quote from William Morse of Newbury, Massachusetts, from that time period. As you can see here, it says, though his wife was accounted a witch, he did wonder that she should be both a healing and a destroying witch. So people had, they were ambivalent about these people. We did have witchcraft laws in Connecticut by this time. Roger Ludlow, mentioned his name earlier, drafted capital laws of Connecticut in 1642. One of them, of course, is the famous, comes from the Bible, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And the laws from England were also incorporated into the Connecticut Code of 1650. Now, to go back to the woman that was accused of being a witch in Windsor. So she was identified as Alice Young. She was the first accused witch executed in New England. And we only know her name. It took us 257 years to find out who she was. In 1647, John Winthrop wrote in his diary, "One blank of Windsor." In 1904, Annie Elliott Trumbull wrote in the Hartford Courant. Her father was a Trumbull. I forget his first name, Jonathan Trumbull or something. Her father had decoded a diary from that time period in which her name is mentioned. I'll show you that in a minute. And then I happen to notice that in the Winthrop Papers, volume 6, there's a quote goes of one John Young, formerly of Windsor, of about Stratford. His wife was hanged for a witch at Connecticut. And I found that in 2017. This is a picture from Matthew Grant's diary. And it says up here that May 26th, that this Alice Young was hanged. And that's the woman. And that's how we know that now. There was another fellow a fellow named Newbury was also hanged. He was hanged for sodomy. And the third person, line down here says that John and Joanna Carrington were also hanged. And these two people were also accused of being witches. They were from Wethersfield. And we know this, at least we knew these people because we have the records and the court records. And this brick memorial stands outside the Hartford Ancient Burial Ground. Somebody has put this in, as you can see, it says Alice Young, witch hanging victim, May 26, 1647. She was not tried in Windsor. She was tried in Hartford and executed in Hartford. Now, this is how this poor Goody Bassett's remembered as an ice cream shop in Stratford, Connecticut. I just thought it was interesting. But the important thing about Goody Bassett is that we know that the Governor Haynes at the time, and a couple of other fellows were sent down to try Goody Bassett in Stratford in 1651. And the important thing about Goody Bassett, which is interesting, is Goody Bassett named somebody else as a witch. She names a woman named Goody Knapp in 1653 and says that she's a witch. So Goody Knapp's accused of being a witch. The Women's Committee searches Knapp for witches' marks. As I said here, this is primarily the way it went. They didn't have men there. Goody Knapp is tried. Midwife Odell testifies that she found witches' teeth on Knapp. Now, people didn't accuse midwives of being witches. That they would accuse healers, people that were not midwives. Midwives had very important role to play in society in England and in New England, and they were generally not accused of being witches. The court concluded that Knapp had familiars and had made a pact with the devil. We don't really, I have to tell you this, we don't really have the trial transcripts themselves. Some of this we have to put together, with the information that we have. Most of this information comes from this comes from something that was published, the records in New Haven. Knapp is imprisoned awaiting her death sentence, but people keep interrogating her. They say they want to know, are there other witches? And why won't you confess? Because they want a confession. She said, but I must not render evil for evil. In other words, she's not going to confess and she's not going to accuse anyone else of being a witch. Everybody wants to accuse this other woman named Mary Staples. I'll explain in a second. So Knapp's taken to her place of execution. Goody Knapp is hanged. And then what happens is her corpse is grabbed by this woman named Mary Staples. And she says, these marks are not, but such as she herself or any woman might have, these so-called witches' marks, witches' teeth. And Lucy Pell, who's a woman that happens to be there, says, I and be hanged for them and deserve it too. So you can see that, Lucy had her suspicions about Mary Staples as well, probably. And today there's a Knapp memorial that was put in place in August 2019 in Bridgewater, Connecticut. And I don't know why I keep losing half my picture here, but anyway, so I'm going to talk about the witch hysteria in Hartford now. So in 1657, John Winthrop Jr. became governor of the Connecticut colony. John Winthrop Jr., I have to tell you briefly, is basically was interested in healing, and he was also an alchemist, besides a lot of other things too. He was one of those Renaissance men, so to speak. So one of the first witch trials that he got involved in, he was involved in a number of witch trials in New Haven. He'd been down in the New Haven colony for a while, and with a woman named Godwin. And so he had a habit of getting involved in these trials, and he did not believe that people could actually be witches, as far as we can tell. He suspected that because he was an alchemist, he knew something about magic and about, you know, how you can't contact the devil, et cetera, et cetera. So he had his suspicions. So as we'll see in this particular case in 1658, this woman named Goody Garlick, she's from Northampton on Long Island. And I don't want to go into too many details, but the people at Northampton, you know, when they accused this woman of being a witch, realized they weren't in a position to try her. So basically, they needed to link up with one of the colonies in order so they could do this. So they linked up. They were comfortable with the Connecticut colony, and so they brought her to Connecticut to be tried in Hartford. So she was tried for witchcraft in 1658, and she was accused of loss of lives of several persons, including a young woman named Betty Howell, who was the daughter of a very important person named Lion Gardner. And to go into the case, she had given Betty Howell the evil eye, as far as Betty was concerned. And she had been responsible for other deaths. They said she was responsible for other deaths on the island. She was a healer also. She tried to help people, but you know, she also was kind of two-sided. She helped people at the same time. She had a really bad reputation. So Betty claimed she was bewitched. That Goody Garlick sent a familiar, caused her to throw up pins, caused all kinds of problems for Betty, and Betty died. And so the people in the town wanted to take Goody to be tried as a witch. So they took her to Hartford, like I said, and Winthrop used his influences in the past. He was skeptical of witchcraft accusations. So what finally happened was, and this is, I found this out myself. I didn't realize this, but you know, Winthrop didn't use English common law really, but he used one of three, what we call the Scots verdicts. This is how the Scots did it. They have guilty, not proven, reserving judgment of guilt or innocence, and not guilty. Now, I didn't I didn't, Professor Woodward has written about this too. I was just kind of surprised to find out that it was it was kind of a Scottish thing. So anyway, I came across this when I was I'm doing something on body snatching. So when I came across this, so basically that was what he used to get these people off. And what happens when you're not proven, reserving judgment of guilt or innocence, means that you're able to go back out into the community. It doesn't mean that you're innocent and doesn't mean that you're guilty, but it means that you better be careful or they're going to haul you back in again. And maybe the second time they will get you as being guilty. And so this is what happened. They sent her back, Goody Garlic, back to the community, back to Long Island. But the problem with doing this is it sounds wonderful, except for the fact that it really got people upset. It offended many people in Hartford. And so when John Winthrop Jr. leaves for England, I'll explain why he does this in a minute, they saw their opportunity to get a conviction when the time came. And this is what happens. In 1660, Charles II is restored to the throne. Winthrop decides he's going to go to England to get a charter for the colony of Connecticut. Why is he going to do this? Well, when those people migrated to Connecticut, not the first group of migrants, well, one of the groups was the people that migrated to Windsor, but also there was another group under Thomas Hooker that migrated to Hartford. Well, they came here, but they didn't have a royal charter to settle. So they really legally weren't supposed to even be a colony, and they needed to have a charter. And so they decided they would get it, they needed to get one, or there would be all kinds of problems in the future. So he decides to go. At the same time, he was still here in Connecticut when this happened. But when Charles I was executed by the authority, the parliamentary authority in England, I think there were 12 judges. A number of those judges were pardoned, but 2 of them weren't. One of them was named William Goff, and the other one was called Edward Whalley. They had fled from England, and they came to New England. They came to New England, they went to Connecticut, and then they went down to New Haven. And when they were in New Haven was a separate colony. The people in New Haven, particularly John Davenport, the Reverend John Davenport, and Governor Lee, hid them. And Charles II sent his agents to find these 2 men. And he knew, and the agents knew, that they were located somewhere in New Haven. They were able to eventually escape and go up to Hadley, Massachusetts, and hide there. But he was really upset with the people of New Haven. Another factor that was a problem at this time that caused anxiety was the fact that you had Quakers coming to New England. And as you probably know, New England was basically a congregational, was settled by Congregationalists and Puritans. And that was the only religion that was permitted. Not even the Anglican religion. The Anglican religion was permitted. So the people in Boston got so upset, for example, that they actually hanged Quakers in the Boston Common, eventually hanging Mary Dyer in 1660. The problem for the people, the Congregationalists in New England, was that Charles was kind of, getting a little soft on the Quakers and saying, they're not so bad. That would change later. But they were getting upset that he was going to permit them to settle here in New England. But the worst thing, the thing that was the most anxious for the people of Hartford, was the fact that their church was in a disarray. This is a quote from, and you have to read about what was going on in the Hartford church for 10 years. There was constant fighting amongst the people that supported the minister, Reverend Stone, because Thomas Hooker had died back in 1647. Thomas Stone and Samuel Stone. the people that supported Samuel Stone. So we've got the, as Cotton Mather says, they issued thunderings and lightnings and earthquakes throughout the colonies. And this caused all kinds of problems all throughout New England on what was going on in the Hartford church. Hartford's best families, now they fought and fought and fought, and they wanted to leave, and they finally got their opportunity in 1659. Some of the best families in Hartford withdrew and went up to Hadley, Massachusetts. And so the Hartford panic begins. In the early 1660s, Hartford was completely disorganized. The people that had left, their land was redivided. It led to boundary disputes. The church was paralyzed on the edge of the wilderness, surrounded by hostile Indians, wolves, and other wild animals. They had encountered recent floods. There was disease, and they were abandoned by their leaders. And so by the spring of 1662, the colony was in a complete crisis. And within this fragmented and dispirited society, the Great Hartford Witch Panic begins. So basically, let me just get this thing here for myself so I can. 71. All right. Just give me a second here to get myself organized. So returning from a church service accompanied by one of her neighbors, an 8-year-old girl named Elizabeth Kelly gets sick. She accuses her neighbor, Goody Ayres, of bewitching her. So how did she get sick? Well, Goody had accompanied her, this woman, Goody Ayres, from church, and she had basically come into their home, her father and mother, and they had a broth going. And the mother said to little Elizabeth, she said, don't drink this broth, it's too hot. And the Ayres woman was there, Goody Ayres, and she said to Elizabeth, yo, you can drink it, go ahead. And so she drank it and she got sick. So she didn't get sick immediately. She went back to church with Goody Ayres. And Goody Ayres is kind of a weird, to me, she's kind of strange. I think she seemed to have some kind of an attachment to this little girl. And one of the reasons I think that was because a few years ago, she was, when she was having a child, a little girl, I believe. It's about 1659, I think. And John Winter Jr. talks about this. She was having trouble in childbirth and she couldn't have the baby. And so they had to squash the baby's head in order for the child to be born. And she really wasn't right, probably since then. The other thing is that she had told stories about how when she lived in London, she had gone out with a fellow and she had met him, and he said to her, would you like to go out with me again? And she said, sure. And then she looked down and she saw he had devil's feet. He had the feet of the devil. And so she had actually met the devil. And these are the kinds of things, of course, that people, there's obviously something wrong with her. But anyway, the fact is that she, so little Elizabeth there, she got really sick, and she began to claim that she'd been bewitched and that she was gonna die. The woman was gonna kill her. And then she wanted her father to get an axe and cut off the woman's head. And so there was all kinds of things going on. And so she finally did die. And her father suspected she had been bewitched to death. And so what I'm showing here is, this is the record of what happened according to the parents. This was available, I was able to, this is a document that's still available. So what happens is little Elizabeth Kelly dies. And so the parents believe that she's been bewitched. And so they want to have an inquest. They want to know what happened. So they get the little girl in a room, she's dead, a corpse, and they bring in Judith Ayres and Goody Wapples, another woman that had helped attend the little girl, and they brought them in to view her corpse. And the father was distraught. He manhandled the little girl because he was hoping that she would bleed in some way, because I'll explain in a minute why. And when Judith Ayres stood near the child's cheek, finally, a reddish spot appeared. And so the father believed that she was the killer. She had bewitched his child to death. And this goes to something called, we know a dead body will bleed upon the witch's touch, and it's in Dalton's Country Justice. And it was considered an ordeal. The next thing is they're still suspicious, so they have an autopsy. They have an autopsy ordered for the child on March 31st, and it's held at the graveside. Go back for a second. So the autopsy, the results are this Dr. Rossiter, who I told you he was one of the ones that came over on that ship, the John and Mary. He determines that her death was not a natural death. And so that makes everybody think, and they believe that she was bewitched. So a coven of witches is suspected in Hartford now. Following the Kelly's deposition presented before an official inquiry, Judith and her husband came under the suspicion of causing Elizabeth Kelly's death. It's believed that the two of them were swum. And as a result, we know that these two were in prison afterwards, but that people helped them escape, and they made their way to Rhode Island, and they were able to get out without, facing possible death. So the next thing that happens is that you have a young woman named Ann Cole, and Ann Cole is a demoniac, if you will. She believes she's possessed by demons. The people believe she's possessed by demons. And there are 4 ministers that come together to determine they're going to just do this. They're going to interrogate Ann Cole as well as the other witches, and they're going to take down everything she says. And the 4 ministers are Joseph Haynes, the son of the governor, the former governor, John Haynes, John Whiting, minister in the Hartford Church, Samuel Hooker, and of course, they're led by Samuel Stone. So in the fall, the Willis house, they were the richest family in town, and they had a large house, and they had a large living room. And so they put, Anne is brought there, and she's put on display in a way, and she's possessed, and she begins to name the people in the town that she believes are witches. And as I said, the ministers are there to take down every utterance of the young girl. She's 16 years old. They actually hold a special day of fasting and prayer in the Willis Manor House in late autumn. I don't know why I can't get my picture here. It's home. So one of the women that's accused is a woman named Rebecca Greensmith. The Reverend Whiting records what Ann Cole said about Rebecca Greensmith, and she was astonished, and at her trial, Rebecca confessed to knowing the devil. She confessed to witchcraft and implicated her husband also. And this is a copy of the original document. I know you can't read it, but it's her original confession that was saved. And one of the things that she talks about is that they had a witches' Sabbath. And she says that at Christmas, they would have a merry meeting, and then she would sign a covenant with the devil, a contract with the devil. Reverend Stone stands up in court and says that he's highly insulted because she's going to sign a pact with the devil on Christmas. Now, one thing that most of us probably don't remember, but in the old days, maybe today too, Christmas was really not, in England anyway, it wasn't that kind of, it wasn't it was a religious holiday, but people did all kinds of wonderful, crazy things on Christmas. A lot of drinking, a lot of dressing up in other people's clothes, things like that. It was a real revelry. And the Puritans were very upset about this. They did not like this at all. And they didn't even celebrate Christmas. Soon this picture here, Puritans forbade Christmas celebration. And we know it was outlawed in Massachusetts, actually. She said that she owned that the devil had frequent use of her body. And she said, in the woods, we danced and had a bottle of sack, which is a fortified wine, and something like a cat called me out. Now here, this gives us the clue that we have a Sabbath, because the cat, of course, is a familiar. And Rebecca named other witches in Hartford. She named a woman named Elizabeth Sager, Mary Sanford, Judith Ayres, who had left, Judith Violet, who was of Dutch descent, James Wakely, this Peter Grant's wife, and a woman named Catherine Palmer. Now, luckily, many of these people get away. Judith Violet was troubled by Marshall Gilbert, though, and she said if it lay in her power, she would do him a mischief of what she could to hurt him. Well, Rebecca is finally convicted and sentenced to death, along with her husband and another woman named Mary Barnes. And as I say here, the hanging the witch was both a crowd entertainment, but it was also a moral lesson for everyone. This picture here just tells me that one of the women that was charged was a woman named Elizabeth Sager, as I said, and her thing was that she was charged, but she was fortunately able to get off. But the one thing that she did, she's one of my favorite people, actually, because she said that what Ann Cole was saying was a lot of hodgepodge. And she also said something very interesting. She was able to quote from the Bible out of the Acts of the Apostles, in which, if people remember that, especially amongst the Protestants, that only Jesus and the apostles, and St. Paul was the last one, could possibly do an exorcism, could talk to demons. And there's a point in there where the demon says, "I don't know you." Some other people try to exorcise this young, I think it's a woman, I'm not sure. And the demon says, "I don't know you. I know Jesus and I know St. Paul, but I don't know you." And she uses that to say that what they're doing with this Ann Cole, these ministers, they don't have a right to do it. They don't even know what they're doing. It doesn't help her, but that's what she said in her defense. Ann Sager herself was not convicted of witchcraft. Nobody could prove. Somebody said they saw her flying. They saw her dancing with Indians. But the problem is the witnesses weren't wearing their glasses, and there's all kinds of problems. But just to let you know, the reason that we know that people weren't happy with the fact that she got away with it, the foreman actually wrote a letter explaining exactly why they didn't convict her. But it didn't stop them. As I said before, John Winthrop was away in England. I hope I said that. And he came back in January of 1663 and was able to, she wasn't convicted, but then in July 1663, they went after her again. And they tried to convict her a second time and then even a third time. And eventually Winthrop was able to set they had condemned her to death, and Winthrop was able to set that aside. So she was one of the few condemned to death that was actually able to, not be killed. To finish this off, we had another witchcraft accusation very late in 1669, a woman named Catherine Harrison. And Winthrop was concerned about this also. And so he asked the ministers, he said, Minister Gershom Buckley, along with a couple of other ministers. So what's the proof? What do we need if we're going to convict somebody of being a witch? And then essentially they said you need to have two witnesses. Two people witness the magical act. And of course, that's likely impossible. Following the Harrison case, there were no more witchcraft cases taken up in Connecticut for the next 22 years until 1692. However, there were no executions in Connecticut. Meanwhile, 19 people were hanged and one man was pressed to death in Salem, Massachusetts. Now, this is a list of executed witches, and I've got this, but I do want to quickly talk about some of the people that are in the cemetery. Let me just go back for a second to this. Recently, as some of you may know, Windsor, there was a resolution in Windsor that passed that said that Alice Young and Lydia Gilbert's good names be restored in the town of Windsor, so they may rest in peace. I didn't talk about Lydia Gilbert, but you know, I don't have time to get into everybody, unfortunately. But what I want to do is for the ancient burial ground, I just want to talk about, just to let you know that you can visit some of these graves of people that were involved. And so first one I'm going to talk about is Governor John Haynes. He's the one that went down with Mr. Kulik and a couple of other people to try Goody Bassett. And it was said that Governor Haynes had made known the need for the harsh treatment of witches. One historian said that, not me. There's an obelisk in the cemetery. It's a huge obelisk. It's got all the founders' names on it. And the one I'm picking out here is a man named Samuel Wakeman. And I picked him out because Samuel Wakeman's actually, he wasn't himself involved. He died in 1640. But he did have his family, his wife Elizabeth Wakeman and his children. His wife Elizabeth married a fellow named Nathaniel Willett. Now Samuel's daughter was Bethany Kelly, who was the little Elizabeth Kelly's mother. And Elizabeth, he also had a daughter named Hannah, Hannah Wakeman, and she married. And the fact is that she was a real character. She wasn't considered a witch until much later in New York, and then that was they said that she really wasn't. But she had a life you wouldn't believe. But anyway, so we have this Samuel Wakeman anyway. But the point I want to make is Elizabeth marries a man named Nathaniel Willett. Nathaniel Willett is the step grandfather of little Elizabeth. And Nathaniel Willett supported this family. He was at the inquest, and he was at a number of different, let's see, he served on the committee of inquest on little Elizabeth, and he was also on the jury that condemned the Greensmiths and Mary Barnes to death for witchcraft. Okay, Hannah Hackleton was the name of the woman. That was a sister. The next one you'll find in that, by the way, this was taken by my granddaughter. I just want to let you know she's 10 years old. I can't take pictures, but she took some of these pictures and did a great job. There's another one. You can tell because I put the cross. We had the cross with the name on it. Another fellow that's buried there, Andrew Benton. How is he connected? Well, Andrew was, he was married to a woman named Hannah, and he was a conservative in the Congregational Church. His father-in-law, George Stocking, was also a conservative in the church. They did not really support Samuel Stone with all the issues that were going on, and they were kind of the rump people that were left over. The rest of the people all went up to Hadley. I talked about. The irony is that Andrew Benton married Ann Cole. And one of the problems that Ann Cole had was she felt she wasn't going to be able to get married and have a husband. And so eventually, Andrew's wife, Hannah, died, and Anne married. She was quite old. I think she was in her 30s by the time she married. And she had the other irony of the whole thing was that the two of them, he was actually a creditor in the Greensmith's property. And so when Andrew married Ann Cole, he'd been living in the Greensmith house with his wife, but when Hannah died, he married Anne, and now Anne moved into the Greensmith house. So anyway, that's who Andrew Benton is. He married Ann Cole, the demoniac. Samuel Willis, well, you know about him. I said his family was quite wealthy. They're the ones that hosted the Ann Cole in their living room or manor. And he was also on the jury. I believe he was on the Lydia Gilbert jury that condemned her to death. He was on the Garlic jury. He was on the Mary Sanford trial that she was convicted and executed. It's a woman. I haven't talked about her, but and he's the one that saved 42 depositions of the cases of witchcraft and kept it in the family, which is why we actually have access to these records today. So we're happy about that. This is a grave of Reverend Thomas Hooker in the cemetery. Thomas Hooker, even though he died about a month after Alice Young was hanged. But I just want to briefly tell you that he was somewhat involved earlier in having to do with what we call, I won't say it's witchcraft, but sort of. He had been involved with this woman named Drake, Mrs. Drake. Before Hooker, there had been another minister, and this is over in England, by the way. This isn't over here. It was in England. There'd been a minister that said that this Mrs. Drake, he would be a witness against her and provide faggots to burn her. Hooker used praying techniques with her, and basically people believed she was possessed, and he helped her. And her maid became Hooker's wife. And he traveled, of course, with Samuel Stone and the ship the Griffin to New England, and eventually they came to Connecticut. But it's interesting to know that, Hooker himself at one point was involved with the demoniac. Samuel Stone, there's a lot with Samuel Stone. His first most famous incidents, which you can easily read about if you read anything written by Cotton Mather, was basically the Mary Johnson episode. She was a young woman from Wethersfield who was accused of being a witch. And this is how he sort of became famous in the colony. He was famous in confronting the devil with her. And people have said that under the guidance of Stone, she confessed to familiarity with the devil, and she was judged very penitent both before and after her execution. And I've talked about Stone. You know about him involved with the tribunal and stuff like that. The Reverend Joseph Haynes. Joseph Haynes is the one that you heard me say that was one of the ones writing down everything that the young Ann Cole was saying. David Gardner, he's the brother of Mary Howell, the young girl that died in East Hampton, New York. I don't know if there's any connection besides the fact that it's just that he was just her brother. And also my understanding is he was the first white man born in Connecticut, I think. I believe that's his claim to fame. Governor William Leet. Governor William Leet was, as I said, was involved with hiding the regicides that I talked about. And there's something else about him I just wanted to tell you. He was also Catherine Harrison was when Catherine Harrison, when they set aside her conviction of witchcraft in 1670, he was the magistrate on that particular court. William Pitkin was now I have this here. He was involved in the autopsy of the young Elizabeth Kelly, and he's the one, he took notes on that. So he was involved there, and he was also on the jury that convicted a woman named Mary Sanford. Gregory Walton, he was involved in the inquest. He was one of the ones that ran out of the room because the smell was so bad. He was also, Wilton was also served on the jury that convicted the Greensmiths and Mary Barnes. And he was also on a jury that acquitted Elizabeth Sager. Jonathan Gilbert was the marshal who Judith Violet said she would do him harm if she could. He's also the one that hanged the Greensmiths. Captain Thomas Bull, his stone is there. And he was involved in that inquest into the Kelly girl's body. And he was also he was a juror on a Catherine Harrison witchcraft case. And finally, James Richards, he was a magistrate in the Sager trial, and he was also a magistrate in the Catherine Harrison trial. And he was also involved with the that trial in 1670, in which her death sentence was set aside. I think that's it. And there's the founder's obelisk in the ancient burial ground cemetery. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. For those, that watch this evening, if you really want to dig into this, the meat of all of this, you can certainly look out for Ross's book. And Ross, if you want to tell them, like, where can you find it? You can certainly find it in the History Center and the Downtown Hartford Public Library. But, where else could they find it?
Well, it's generally available, like right now, on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. It's because it's kind of an academic book. The publisher, doesn't really show up in regular bookstores, so you have to order it generally to get a copy of it. You know what I mean? Because as I said, it's more of an academic book, and it's kind of expensive, for a paperback. It's usually runs between around $35 and $40. So I don't set that price, they did, so right. Unfortunately. But it is available.
It is available, and you can.
And it's also available. And it's available online too. You can get it from Amazon as an ebook, in Barnes and Noble. It's a lot cheaper.
There are a couple questions I want to see if we can, like, maybe quickly in the next 5 minutes or so get to a couple of these. And I know that you had mentioned that you couldn't really speak to, or you didn't have time to speak to Lydia Gilbert's case. But there was somebody in the audience that was curious about that. And maybe if you don't have the time to really speak to it, is that case in your book? And where else could someone find information about Lydia Gilbert?
Yes, it's in the book. I mean, I can speak to it. It depends what the question is,
It was more general in terms of, if you had more information about the case.
I do have information about the case if they're interested. Yeah, sure. I don't have any problem.
Excellent. There was a question here as well about Amy Zavrell had mentioned my 11th great-grandfather. And by the way, there are a number of people that are here in the room that have, whose ancestors were founders or folks that were accused of being witches. So it's pretty incredible audience here this evening. And so Ms. Zavrell's 11th great-grandfather was Thomas Wells, a juror in several Connecticut cases. And she asked, would these jurors and judges have been unconditionally respected for their role in the trials, or would there possibly have been settlers who would have objected to these proceedings? And you kind of touched a little bit on this on the Elizabeth Sager case, but I don't know if you can kind of speak to that a little bit more in your research?
Yeah, I have to say that I found that these people were pretty pretty good about looking for the truth. They weren't just sitting, the jurors didn't just, listen to everything and go, oh yeah, they're guilty. They wanted to see proof. And the best I can give you is the case, although the thing that they got upset with though is when people, I hate to say this, but when John Winthrop Jr. would set the cases aside and put them back into the community, and then they got upset. If a jury did do their work, and of course, I told you that in one particular case, they had to kind of send out a letter justifying what they did, but at least
Right.
they did do that. So you can see that they looked into the proof. They wanted evidence for any kind. If there was something that somebody did. Now, there are things that come up. I mean, if you went into that other case I talked about, where they would determine that the woman that had the midwife claimed she had the witch's teats, that woman, Mary Staples, didn't believe it.
Right.
But everybody else practically did, and she had to shut up, because what happened was she knew that if she said too much, they would accuse her of being a witch too. So it depended on the case, I think, in a lot of ways.
In what you've dug into, do you have any evidence of folks that were involved in the prosecutions offering any apology? This is a question that also came in, and they said, as was the case in Salem.
Afterwards, not that I know of. No, there were other cases too. I mean, there were cases. I think it was the Harrison case. I mean, you have to. I didn't go into all the cases, but I only took it up to about 1663. You know what I mean?
Right.
I brought you up a little bit to why the magistrates stopped bringing up cases. Bringing them into court, because they needed to have that proof. As I said, that the ministers said they needed the proof, but that didn't mean people weren't still trying to do it. And the thing is that, we know there was a big another outbreak of witch hunting in the latter part of the 1680s, because it was around the same time as the Salem witch trials. And so they, yeah, and you have to remember, these people, just when someone was accused of being a witch, nobody forgot about it. This woman, Mary Staples, I told you about, she was accused of being a witch finally. And then her daughter and even her granddaughter was accused of being a witch in the, I forget the date now, but around in the late 1680s. So this stayed with people. It didn't just go away,
It's like generational.
It was generational,
Right,
yeah.
generation.
Yeah.
Folks, I thank you so much for everybody's questions. And I know we haven't been able to get to everybody's, but we are coming to the end of the presentation, and we want to just, give thanks to Richard Ross for being and, spending all this time presenting with us today and sharing his knowledge. And where can folks, I want to ask one last question before Ty wraps it up, is where can folks go to find some of these documents? So especially some of these letters and that you had located, and I think you also spoke to like the records of the parents of Elizabeth Kelly and the confession by Rebecca Greensmith. These kinds of letters that you pulled up. Where could those be located?
They're available online. Actually, you can get them from the Connecticut Library.
Yep.
Has material, and they actually have put for example, that diary, Grant diary, that's available. You got to be able to find the page though. And then the Brown University has a lot of these available online. You can access those too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks so much, Mr. Ross and Ty. We can wrap this up, and get everyone.
Yasmin, thank you so much for hosting us. Richard, thank you so much for your presentation. This is awesome. It's very impressive to see how many people have joined our little meeting tonight. And the ancient burying ground is open to the public and it's free to visit. You can see the gravestones of all these people that Richard was talking about. They're all there. Come on down and thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. It was great. Thank you.